hoping SpongeBob gives me inspiration on this one. I think I need it. This is huge. Written by a man who was there and so famous to history. But this history is quite a convoluted one and a difficult one. So I have an interest in military history and especially World War II. Therefore, I've done a lot of reading around the rise of Hitler and the National Sozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, the NSDAP, the Nazi Party. And through that, you read something like Mein Kampf. Terrible book, but if you're interested in history and those climatic events, really it's something you should read. Doesn't make you a German, doesn't make you a Nazi. And therefore, by due process, I ended up reading bits about the Spanish Civil War. And there was a book, when I read it, that was so convoluted, so difficult to read. It was giving you all these acronyms of all the Spanish parties and the Phalange and the Republicans, and then there was this brigade and that brigade and all these battles, and it was difficult, very difficult to keep track of. So when I saw this staring at me in a bookstore called Unity in Auckland, wonderful, it's got so many good books in there. I looked at it and I looked back and I thought, shall I not? Is this going to be as difficult to follow as the others? And it could be, it could very well be. I'm about that far in, not very far. And I had no idea how long it was going to take me to even approach talking about this. It's quite intimidating. There's not just one revolution, there's three. And I thought, oh, here we go. But to my surprise, it's well written. It's very, very good. It's translated by Max Eastman, who I believe was an American writer who was left-leaning, very pro, no doubt, Trotsky. And of course, I'm dealing with the prejudices that I grew up with, hearing around me in the 1970s of strikers, militants, who were called Bolsheviks or Bolshi people, Trotskyites, Marxists, and all that. And it was like a slur used against anybody who was prepared to stand up against the authority of an organisation, who wanted better working rights. You know, the stuff that you would think everybody would want, but in a capitalist society like I was growing up in, and of course it was the Cold War, there's certain things you don't do. And one is criticise the government. So I came with this with a lot of personal baggage, thinking, all right, okay. But I've been slightly abused or disabused of those kind of things I'm carrying with me. Most historians, when they write something of such complex nature, they, I think, go a bit too deep. So if we imagine the French Revolution or the war of World War I, World War II, the Spanish Civil War, the collapse of Imperial Germany after the war with the Freikorps, and then the coming of the Weimar Republic, and if you especially consider this and the events being talked about here, if we see it like an ocean, a lot of writers, in my experience, like to account for every single wave. And it's too in-depth, it's too exhausting. So far, Trotsky hasn't done that. He gives the underlying great swells and the currents. And therefore, it's an easier read and a more enjoyable read. And when, as I was reading this point, and he says the following, it seemed as though the war, he's now talking about the year 1914-15 and the war, had produced a new working class. To a considerable extent, this was the fact. In Petrograd, or St. Petersburg, the personnel of the workers had been renewed almost 40%. The revolutionary succession had been abruptly broken. All that existed before the war, including the Duma faction of the Bolsheviks, had suddenly retired to the background, and almost disappeared in oblivion. But under cover of this quietness and patriotism, and to some extent even monarchism, the moods of a new explosion were gradually accumulating in the masses. Now, there's a lot of words there that if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's going to go over your head. Bolshevism, monarchy, what are you talking about? But as I read it, I thought that, yeah, Trotsky was right. When I've come across the Russian Revolution being taught in school, and I've taught it myself, there's always the account of Stolypin and his necktie, in other words, nooses. And then there was the events before, and there were the events leading up to the war. Although they're important, they don't really need it. You can start in 1914. And I think that for me is quite refreshing. It makes it a lot easier, because a lot of the stuff that you could consider, Octoberists, cadets, the Bund, all these political parties almost disappear by the time you get to the first revolution. And that's where I'm going to start. However, a lot of stuff that I've already taught, you might think, I have no idea where we are and what's happening. So just to help, I'm going to do a little video that I've made that really gives a few of the main points from 1900 up until 1905. And then I'll carry on or start from that point. So enjoy. In the year 1900, Vladimir Ulyanov, better known as Lenin, departed Russia and went to Western Europe, and he would remain in exile for the next 17 years. He believed that the only way to get rid of the hated Tsarocracy, the autocratic state of Russia, and its associated capitalist system could only come through class conflict. While in exile, he started a newspaper called Iskra, the Spark. The next year, in 1901, in St. Petersburg, a Russian student shot the Minister of Education. The clampdown was oppressive, which led to riots and strikes. Strikes would become the symbol of workers' unrest for the next 17 years. It was also at one of these protests that for the first time the red flag was used. Tolstoy, the famous author, sided with the protesters and argued that to protest was not a crime, but the state and the Okhrana, the secret police, saw it otherwise. Tolstoy was excommunicated by the church, and because the church supported vehemently the autocracy of the Tsar, in the eyes and minds of workers, the church was seen just as bad as the Tsar. In 1902, the Russian army called up reserves. As Martin Gilbert writes in The History of the 20th Century, Volume 1, the annual intake of soldiers into the Russian army was coming more and more from groups that were influenced by anti-Tsarist propaganda. Young university teachers, doctors and lawyers were likewise influenced by the anti-monarchical, anti-aristocratic and anti-capitalist emphasis of the revolutionaries. The spread of revolutionary ideas among the peasantry was the most serious threat for the Tsarist authorities. Events in 1903 showed the Russian people that the Tsar could not be trusted. Due to political unrest, he published a manifesto in which he said ways in which the peasants' lives could be improved, and then completely went against it within less than a month. In exile, Lenin wrote What is to be Done, and in it he states categorically that any member of the Revolutionary Party should only consist of people whose profession were revolutionaries. He was challenged in the leadership of the paper Iskra, and at a vote only just maintained control. He therefore called him and his followers the Bolsheviki, the majority, whereas the others, against him, were known as the Mensheviki, or Mensheviks. By the time of 1914, and what Trotsky calls the Great Reset, the Mensheviks are no longer a power. Also in 1903, the Okhrana, the secret police, and the Tsar fell back into a typical measure to distract people from themselves. They fomented unrest throughout Russia against Jews. Many Jewish houses and businesses were attacked in a pogrom, and many were killed. There were mass protests against this and the complicity of the Tsarist government. The years 1904 and 1905 saw major imbalance in the east. The Russian Empire stretched from St. Petersburg all the way to Vladivostok. It wrapped itself around the planet. But the major threat in that quarter was the rise of Japan, and especially her navy. The Tsar, convinced that his own navy was far superior, sent a fleet from the Baltic which had to sail around the world to join forces in the Sea of Japan. In the Straits of Tsushima, they forced a battle against the Japanese and lost. So great was the resulting unrest and destabilization of the government that finally the Tsar was forced to listen and had to introduce the Duma, the parliament. Power was invested in those members of the aristocracy around him. Certain things were gifted to the Russian people, but not much. As far as the workers were concerned, nothing really changed. The way was open for greater unrest. There you go, just a few points from the past leading up to 1914, so that if I read this again, it may make a bit more sense. It seemed as though the war had produced a new working class. To a considerable extent, this was the fact. In Petrograd, the personnel of the workers had been renewed almost 40%, because a lot of the men had gone to the war front, which I'll talk about in a moment. All that existed before the war, including the Duma faction, that's the parliament, and the Bolsheviks, Lenin, had suddenly retired to the background and almost disappeared in oblivion. The moods of a new explosion were gradually accumulating. I can't say that word. I'll say that again. The moods of a new explosion were gradually accumulating in the masses. So, 1915 really, around about August, is the point in which I'm going to start talking about this book. I think there's going to be, well, obviously, multiple episodes. If you don't like Russian history, it's going to bore you senseless. Of course, what anybody has who has this book, is the English version of what was written in Russian, Cyrillic. And good question is, when was this written? This was first published in 1932, and at that point Trotsky, I think, was in exile. Yes, he was internally exiled to Alma-Ata in Siberia in 1928. He was deported from the country in 1929. He lived in Turkey, France and Norway before settling in Mexico in 1937. And of course, he knew Frida Kahlo, and he was executed in 1940. And he was written out almost of Russian history by his nemesis, Stalin. So he's talking about grand events, grand historical events that not just affected Russia, but also affected the rest of the world. Now, in 1968, the then Chinese premier, Zhou Enlai, did a state visit to France. And he was asked, what do you think about the revolution? And he said, it's too early to tell. Now, he may have been asked about the student rights of 1968 in Paris, in which case he would have been correct. But it was picked up that he was answering about the French Revolution, which started in 1789. And to say, almost 200 years later, that it's too early to tell has tickled a lot of historians by saying, yeah, some of these grand themes that occur never play out that quickly. They take centuries. You could justifiably say, what do you think about Christianity? And someone could say, well, it's too early to tell. Same kind of thing. Well, the themes and the things that are talked about to do with the Russian Revolution, it's too early to tell. We're still in a world affected by it. So there was the revolution itself, the two in 1917. There was the Russian Civil War. There were the pogroms that Stalin introduced, the show trials. They had a long-lasting effect, not just in Russia, but abroad. There was the war, of course, the Great Patriotic War that Russia lost millions in, most than any other country. There was the Cold War afterwards. Some say the Cold War never ended, although officially it's supposed to have done, with the fall of communism and the Russian Federation and so on. So what happens here is part of a long, staggering process that really we're not out of. So he writes well, just Trotsky, and a lot is mentioned. And I'm really 1914, I said 1914, I mean 1915 is where it gets to. And this is just to remind me what to talk about. So in 1915, there's certain things that feeding into Russia. And as far as those in control are concerned, the only thing that unites them is fear. The Duma, the parliament, is primarily controlled by the aristocracy. The first of the 1917 revolutions will strip them away from power and give it to the bourgeoisie. The second revolution of 1917 strips it away from the bourgeoisie and gives it to the workers. So we see from 1905 to 1917, early 1917, late, the erosion of power from on high, and it's getting lower and lower into the masses. So let's go through what Trotsky is talking about. And I'm going to put that here so I can just look at it to remind me what to talk about. I think the first thing is Slavophilism. This becomes, or was apparent, just leading up to World War I. So in 1914, what started the Second World War was the death of Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo by a man who was part of a group called the Black Hand. He was Gavrilo Princip. He was Serbian. Serbia wanted to unite itself with all other fellow Slav people, including the Russians. They were pretty much different cultures and languages, but they were united in this idea that the Slavs were one people. And that was very much a motive force in Russia up until the revolutions. But what it meant was that it effectively put a block up against getting on with other peoples. It also put Russia on course to support small independent nations, or nations that wanted to become independent, from Austria-Hungary, and therefore to go to war. The other thing that he mentions is the fact that Russia came late to the party when you think of industrial might. Russia then and now is a vast open country. It's part of Europe up until the Ural Mountains, and then beyond that the rest of it is part of Asia. But there is a lot of stuff in the ground that you could extract and use for industries. In the olden days it wasn't known. But when the Industrial Revolution occurred in Britain and then Belgium and then beyond, Russia was very backward. But it benefited from the fact that it came late to the party. And what Trotsky says is quite rightly, if you compare, say, Britain, to go from the Middle Ages to the point where it was producing great weaponry, it took very many steps, slowly to that point. Russia didn't have to do that. It just went from backward to suddenly taking armaments, or in this case, railways and factories that had already been produced abroad. So it went from relative backwardness and emptiness to suddenly a thriving place for commerce. But it didn't have the money to do so. So the problem was that most of the liquidity that came into the country was from foreign capitalists, foreign money. I think 40% of the economy was controlled by foreign interests. You imagine that, say, in the States. If 40% was proven to have been controlled, say, by a foreign nation, it would cause upset. And that was one of the reasons there was a revolution. All the money that was being made tended to go out to foreign people. The Russians weren't benefiting from it, even though it was then benefiting from vast resources. So foreign capital, trains and factories. But you can't get away from the fact that until 1915, you can go back a generation to backwardness. It was very quick, it was very impressive, but ultimately very fragile. Another thing that in 1915 Russia was suffering from, according to Trotsky, is the Byzantine autocracy, which is a wonderful way of looking at it. Byzantine is like this labyrinthine departments all watching each other, all keeping tabs on each other, spying. It was the arbitrariness of the Tsar at the top, who could make a decision one day and then change it the next. People to get on had to agree to this and enable it. There were backstabbing departments. In the Second World War, much has been said about Nazi Germany and what's known as the Führer Principle, the Führer principle, where as long as he was okay in his room and kept alone, all the other departments could do what they want, and they end up backstabbing each other. It was a complete mess. The other thing that Trotsky points out is that this bureaucracy was mainly of a German origin, which was brought in by Peter the Great. So you had the Russian Slavophile people controlled by a very thin, oppressive German-style form of government. And it was always a problem. It never really fitted in with the scope of the country and the type of people it had to deal with. Another line that comes into this 1915 point is the servile clergy. Trotsky calls it a wonderful phrase. It's on page 5, just here. 200,000 priests and monks were in all essentials a part of the bureaucracy, a sort of police of the gospel. The Russians were naturally very religious. What was coming into recognition were these almost like charismatic priests. Rasputin was one of them, who were like starets, I think they were called. They were very enigmatic, piercing eyes and that kind of stuff. But they were very much for the autocracy. They got their stipends and they got their positions because of it. And of course, when the Metropolitan of Moscow backed the Tsar and they excommunicated a hero like Tolstoy, didn't go down well with the people. So a servile clergy didn't help. There's one thing that I'm still processing. I'm a bit confused about it myself. And he says there was no third estate. Now, the third estate was very much French Revolution. You had the first, second and third estates, and it was like a pyramid going up. And in fact, I've seen an image similar to this done for Russia at the time for school books. It's like a pyramid, the mass of people at the bottom, and then as it gets narrower and narrower to the top where the Tsar is, there's less and less people within those bands. That was definitely France. The first estate was the king and his family, and then the second estate were really the bishops and the lords, the noblesse, and then the third estate was everybody else, including the doctors and lawyers. But according to Trotsky, that wasn't the case in Russia, and it was a problem because there was not a group of people that could stand up to the autocracy who did so against the French king and the revolution. Russia was controlled by landlords, and a lot of the landlords of the bourgeoisie got their money from abroad. So they wanted to prop up the Tsar as much as possible. And when things started to turn to custard, they're the ones most likely to want to try and take over power. And that happens very much in the early part of 1917. There's two more to talk about. One's the army. The army was vast, but very, very ill-equipped. But what it did do is that when the war started, and it was shown that the average Russian soldier had very little equipment, poorly fed, poorly led, and mass desertion, because they had been involved with bombs and gas and trench warfare. That had been a training ground that, because they become revolutionary, they took those ideas with them back when they deserted or they fled, that then when they went into the Red Brigades, which Trotsky made into the army, they were very capable and therefore ready to do the bidding of someone who was going to say, we're going to make this a paradise for you, the workers. He got a quote here. An observant woman called Fyodorchenko, serving as sitter of mercy, listened to the conversations of the soldiers, this is in the war, almost to their thoughts, and cleverly wrote them down on scattered slips of paper. The little book thus produced, The People at War, permits us to look in that laboratory where bombs, barbed wire entanglements, suffocating gases, and the baseness of those in power had been fashioning for long months the consciousness of several million Russian peasants, and where along with human bones age-old prejudice were cracking. In many of the self-made aphorisms of the soldiers appear already the slogans of the coming civil war. Just like in Germany in World War I, when things were beginning to collapse, mass waves of people who'd been conscripted, taken to war, if they survived the horror of what they had to put through, and it was bad enough their conditions imposed on them by their own army, they went back with one thing in mind: to get rid of those in control who were pretty much useless, and therefore seek revenge. And they knew how to hold a gun, they knew what to do, and they were prepared to work together and be ordered around. That's potentially one of the real key themes that we can think about just before we get or embark on the history of this revolution. And the final one that I've made is fatalism and speculation. The Russian people by 1915 had come to believe they weren't going to win this war. Something drastic had to change. The war, when it started, got rid of all of the pettiness and the arguing beforehand. That's what Trotsky says. It delayed any thought of the revolution. I think Lenin, at that point, still in exile, said there's not going to be a revolution, the people aren't ready for it. And he believed the only way to get rid of the autocracy was to have a revolution. So people went to war wanting to go to war. Russia said they're going to get lots of land out of it. They're going to win. They're going to be victorious. The defeats of 1905 seemed a long way back. And then when they started to lose, people thought, hey up, this government hasn't got a clue. Not only did they lose against Japan, we're now losing bigly against Germany. And although they have some success against Austria-Hungary, that was more to do with the weakness of Austria-Hungary than it was to do with the greatness of Russia. So they had this fatalism. Nothing's going to improve, and in fact it's only going to get worse. What if Germany wins and takes over the country? They hated Germany. They hated the fact that the Tsar's wife was German. But perhaps the hardest, most difficult thing to swallow was speculation. And this always comes up, but it's often overlooked. So when a country is going down the drain, and we can study France with the revolution before Napoleon, we can study Germany 1919. 1917 was what's known as the turnip winter. People were so hungry they were eating stuff that they considered only fit for animals. And the internal infrastructure and command collapsed. But there were still people speculating on making money. They were still after contracts for ammunition, munitions, infrastructure, even though no one could afford it, even though it was exorbitant prices, the government was desperate for loans and money. Many people wanted to prolong the agony, prolong the war, the destruction of a whole country, so they could make money out of it. And that happens all the time. It's like a dying animal and lots of vultures are there waiting to peck and pick away at the corpse. And that comes across really well in the book. So just to remind you, that's what I've just talked about. These tendrils leading to this focal point, 1915, and I think in the next episode I do some way down the line, I'll then start looking at the events from 1915 to 1917 and possibly the first of the revolutions, which strips away the power of the aristocracy from the Duma and gives it to then the bourgeoisie, in the hopes it would staunch the rot, but it doesn't. I find it fascinating only because I have a predilection for this kind of thing. Is this a book you should read? It's hard to say. I'm trying to find a thing I made about the language. It can be a bit tortuous at times. There is one thing that I'll probably do the next episode for the book, is explaining these terms like proletariat and what that all means. As to the book, Trotsky is giving his account. How truthful it is, that's down to debate. He writes very well and very succinctly, and I imagine in the Russian it will be so powerful. There's things here you read that suddenly I'm thinking, alliteration, but that's in English. That would have been Max Eastman. I don't think it would equate necessarily the same in Russian. There is a bit stiltedness, although if I read this out, it probably won't sound stilted now, but when I first read it, I thought, you can tell this has been translated. It's the construction of the English. He says, a group of extreme rights, sturdy bureaucrats inspired by Dernova, you don't need to know who that is, who had put down the revolution of 1905, took that moment to present to the Tsar a proposed programme. The eye of these experienced officials, trained in a serious police school, saw not badly and pretty far, and if their prescription was no good, it is only because no medicine existed for the sickness of the old regime. Slightly stilted, but I don't know if that is because Eastman is trying to get as accurate a translation to the original, or for some reason lost in translation. If you're interested in history, if you are interested in the 20th century, crucial to read it, to better understand the flow of events. Winston Churchill famously described the Soviet Union, which was an organisation that did not exist in 1915. He was talking about the Soviet Union then under Stalin, and he said, I cannot forecast to you the action of Russia. It is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, but perhaps there is a key. That key is Russian national interests. The key to understanding the revolutions is the interests of the people. It's all about people. There's a tendency in Marxism to talk about the grand scope of history and the stages of history you must go through. All well and good in theories. But it's really, can the man and woman put enough food on their table to feed themselves and their children? Do they have work? Are they left in peace, or are they constantly oppressed? That's the key themes. That's the reason why there was a revolution to begin with. They felt that wasn't happening. The events that occur, as far as this is concerned, is one-sided. We're not getting other people's point of view. This is only one, Trotsky. And he was eventually booted out because he fell out of favour. So we must remember that. It could be very one-sided. It could be also very prosaic. This is a guy trying to paint himself potentially in a good light. I'll be interested to see whether he is self-critical. But it's definitely a book because it has value because of the historical moment and moments in which millions of people were sucked into like a cauldron. So I would say just for that, it's probably worth a read, even if cursory. I will do more because I think it deserves some kind of, or somebody out there talking about it. But for now, I'm going to put it down. So if you got this far, thank you very much. Please leave a comment. What do you think? Is it worth the pains and the study? Or do you think it's overrated? Anyway, ta-ta for now.